Dusty Springfield made a decision in 1964 that she did not have to make. She was, at that point, the most important female pop voice in Britain. She had her own career, her own records, her own television appearances, her own fan base. She did not need to spend her professional capital on behalf of someone else. But she made the decision anyway, and the decision changed Tom Jones's life. She had heard him sing, not on a record, in person, at a television rehearsal, a moment when the cameras were off and the microphone was live, and Tom Jones, unaware that anyone of consequence was listening, sang the way he always sang, because there was no other way available to him. Dusty Springfield heard it, and she understood immediately, with the specific clarity of one performer recognizing another, what she had heard. She went to the people with the power to open America to him. She did not go as a fan. She went as a peer. As a professional who had been in the industry long enough to know the difference between a voice that was impressive for this moment and a voice that would matter beyond it. Her own career gave her standing to make the case. She also went knowing what she was spending. Professional capital is a real thing. It is built slowly and spent quickly. When you spend it on someone else's behalf, you take a risk that is not proportional to your personal investment in the outcome. If the person you have championed fails, you have spent your capital and received nothing. If they succeed, you receive the private satisfaction of having been right, which is not nothing, but is not the same as championing yourself. Dusty Springfield went anyway. She made her case. The case was Tom Jones. This was not a simple thing she was doing. The people she was going to had their own opinions, their own frameworks for evaluating new acts, their own sense of what the American market wanted and what it would reject. They were not going to be moved by enthusiasm. They were going to be moved by argument, by the specific, precise case that this voice was different from the other voices they were being asked to consider. And Dusty Springfield was going to have to make that case in language that a boardroom could receive. Not the language of excitement, not the language of instinct, the language of evidence. She had the evidence. She had heard it. She had heard the difference between a voice that was powerful and a voice that was true. And she had decided before she walked into that room that she was going to say it clearly, and she was going to keep saying it until the room understood. This is what she did. This is why it worked. The record label she went to was the American branch of a major company. The people in the room were executives who made decisions about which British acts would be promoted in the American market. The decision she was asking them to make required money. It required promotional infrastructure. It required the kind of institutional commitment that did not come from a conversation with a woman who had heard a voice and could not stop thinking about it. But the conversation was what they got. And the conversation was persuasive. Because Dusty Springfield was persuasive. And because what she was saying about the voice was true. And because true things have a specific quality in rooms full of people whose job it is to find them. It's Not Unusual was released in Britain in January 1965. It reached number 1. The American market received it. The promotional infrastructure that Dusty Springfield had helped put in place was there to meet it. Tom Jones arrived in America. He was 24 years old. He had a number 1 single. He had bookings. He had a machine behind him that had not been there before. And he had something else, something harder to name and harder to build. The specific support of someone who had seen him before the machine existed, who had decided, without being asked and without any guarantee of return, that what she had seen was worth the risk of her own credibility. Tom Jones arrived in America. He arrived with enough behind him to be heard, and the reason enough was behind him was that one person, before the charts, before the bookings, before the machine, had stood in a room of executives and told them what she had heard. That was the first payoff. The American audiences who heard Tom Jones in 1965 were hearing someone who was there because one person had made a choice that she did not have to make. The music industry in 1965 did not have a mechanism for this kind of support. There was no formal structure by which one artist championed another through the executive layer of a record company. What Dusty Springfield did was informal. It was personal. It was the kind of thing that happened because a specific person decided to do it, not because any system was designed to produce it. And the informal, personal nature of it was exactly what made it effective. Executives respond to data. They respond to market analysis. They respond to the accumulated weight of institutional opinion. But they also respond to the direct testimony of someone with standing, someone who has earned the right to be listened to, someone whose track record of accuracy in this specific domain is beyond dispute. Dusty Springfield in 1964 was that person. She had the track record, she had the standing, and she was using it for Tom Jones. The executives who heard her case that day were in the presence of something unusual. A performer advocating for another performer. Not for business reasons, not for strategic reasons. Because she had heard something true, and she had decided the true thing needed to be in the world at the scale it deserved. They listened. They committed. The promotional infrastructure was built, and Tom Jones arrived in America with it already in place. Tom Jones in 1964 was 24 years old. He had come to London from Pontypridd with very little except the voice and the determination to use it in rooms large enough to matter. London in the early 1960s was a city in the middle of a musical revolution. The acts that were breaking through were doing so quickly and completely. The acts that were not breaking through were disappearing into the clubs and the pub circuits and the grinding work of performing to rooms that did not know your name. Tom Jones was in the second category when Dusty Springfield heard him. He was unknown in any way that mattered commercially. He had what was required. He did not yet have the alignment. Dusty Springfield was not part of the machinery, but she understood it well enough to know how to speak to it, and she had heard something in Tom Jones's voice that she believed the machinery would eventually have to respond to. The only question was whether the response would come in time. Before Tom Jones had exhausted the resources of will and determination that were keeping him going in the absence of what the machinery had not yet provided, this was not a small moment to intervene in. This was 1964. The music industry on both sides of the Atlantic was undergoing its most dramatic reshaping in decades. The Beatles had crossed from Britain to America and had changed the entire calculation. Everyone was looking for the next British act that would make the crossing. Everyone was making their case for their version of the answer. Dusty Springfield did not work this way. She was not interested in the next wave. She was interested in Tom Jones specifically. Not because he was British and therefore a commercial proposition in the American market, because she had heard what was in his voice, and she had decided that it needed to be heard. The distinction matters. There is a difference between championing a person because they represent a category you believe in, and championing a person because you have heard them and you cannot stop thinking about what you heard. Dusty Springfield was doing the second thing. What she had heard in that television rehearsal was a voice that did not perform emotion. It contained emotion. The difference is audible if you know what you are listening for, and inaudible if you do not. Dusty Springfield knew what she was listening for. She had been building her own voice for a decade. She had been working out, for a decade, what the difference felt like from the inside. She knew when she heard someone else doing the real thing. She knew because the real thing felt different. It arrived differently. It settled differently in the room. Tom Jones's voice arrived and settled differently. She heard it in that rehearsal room, and she decided then that she was going to make sure the right people heard it too. Not just heard the record. Records were heard all the time, by all kinds of people, and most of them passed through the industry's attention without leaving a mark. She was going to make sure the right people heard it understood, heard it with the context that would allow them to know what they were receiving. She understood that what she was offering the executives was not just a voice. She was offering them an understanding of a voice that they could not have arrived at on their own, because they had not spent a decade building their own voice and therefore did not have the internal reference point that made the recognition possible. She was the reference point. Her own authority, her own record of being right about music, was the instrument she was using to make the case for Tom Jones. He never forgot this. The way he spoke about Dusty Springfield in interviews over the following decades had a specific quality. Not the quality of public acknowledgement, which can be performed. The quality of private truth being offered to the public record. He said she had done something for him that had not been required of her. He said she had heard something in him that the industry had not yet fully heard. He said her decision had mattered, had materially, concretely changed the trajectory of his career in a way that the institutional support that came later could not claim. Because it came after the decision had already been vindicated. Dusty Springfield's support came before, when it was still a choice, when it still required something. That is what made it different. That is why he never forgot it. Dusty Springfield died in 1999. She did not live to see Tom Jones's second act, the Sex Bomb years, the Reload album, the return to the front of popular music's attention. She did not live to see the full extent of what her decision in 1964 had helped set in motion. But she had seen enough. She had seen Tom Jones become the thing she had told the American executives he would become. She had seen the voice reach the rooms it was built for. She had seen the prediction she had made in 1964 come true. There is something worth sitting with in this. The thing that made Tom Jones's American career possible was not a record label decision made in a boardroom. It was not a chart position or a television appearance. It was a single person who had heard something and had decided that the thing she had heard was worth the risk of her own credibility. The industry eventually agreed with her. The audiences eventually agreed with her. The chart positions and the bookings and the Las Vegas contracts eventually all agreed. But she had agreed first. She had agreed before the agreement was easy, before it was the obvious position, before the evidence was conclusive to anyone who had not simply listened. That is the decision that mattered. Not the ones that came after, when the answer was already known. The one that came before, when the only evidence was the voice. When the only qualification was having heard it and having decided that what you heard was true. Dusty Springfield heard Tom Jones. She decided it was true. She went and said so. The rest is what you already know.